of a Solid Ground with artist Ren. And please excuse my pronunciation, Gregorčič. And my name is Kelly, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at Trocadero. For those of you who are not familiar with Trocadero, we are a nonprofit artist-run initiative located in Footscray, Victoria, supported by the City of Marlborough. I'd also like to acknowledge that Trocadero sits on the traditional lands of the Boonwurrung and Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we offer our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. In tonight's conversation, we'll talk about the ideas and processes behind Ren's new body of experimental research and series of work Hollow, produced during the rise and expansion of the pandemic. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat addressed to the host, Ren or myself. We'll try answering them as we go, but we'll also have time for questions. This talk is being recorded and it will be uploaded to Trocadero's YouTube channel, together with the links to Ren's website and his other projects. Now, without further ado, we'll turn the time over to our artist, Ren.
Hi, Kelly. Thanks for having me. So my name is Ren Gregorčič. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm based in Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging. And I'd also like to shout out to the amazing Pikurong in Guditjmara down in Southwest Victoria, who I've worked with quite closely over the past couple of years, and are just a wonderful mob to work with. So shout out to them. Yeah, wonderful people.
To have you, Ren. So excited to hear more about your project and learn more about your research.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been 15 years kind of in the making, getting to this point, and over that time, I've kind of learnt a lot about my philosophies of art, what I think is important, and what I want to discuss, and matching that with technology. And I think that's probably one of the hardest challenges of my artistic career, is matching technology, the right technology, with the right ideas. And so it's really wonderful to talk about North of a Solid Ground, because I think that this is a work that really was a turning point in my career a little bit, because it was kind of bringing together of so many disparate ideas through technology into an exploration of what seemed like a common material.
That's right. Should we have some images of your work on the share screen so that people have visual references while we continue our conversation?
Yep, I'll bring those up here. Share screen. So I'm just going to go to my website, and these images are available at any time. So if you'd like to have a look. This year, I am lucky enough to be continuing my PhD at the Australian National University. I began my PhD in 2020, kind of during the pandemic, and unfortunately during the fires that really ravaged southeastern Australia. And so it was a very interesting time for me to be developing work, because the world was quite unstable in many ways. The air was quite thick with smoke and very acidic. And so all of those kind of environmental pressures really fed into the work. We'll discuss it a little bit more, but here are some kind of introductory images into this work, which is called North of a Solid Ground. It consists of several components. The first component is this 3D printed concrete block. It's a replica of the block that is on the right, so that is the original. And this blue concrete replica is exhibited in an installation of about 6 painted concrete blocks, which are kind of meant to imitate in many ways many of the common concrete blocks that we're very familiar with. They often have a bit of a texture that's a bit rough and areas of blackening. So through watercolor in particular, I've recreated some of those textures. The concrete block replica itself is printed with a plastic called a PLA, and it has been printed layer by layer to create these really quite amazingly intricate kind of sections, what you can see throughout the work. And it stands at 1:1 scale. So a concrete block is about 390 by 190 by 190 millimeters. So you can kind of get a sense of that brick. Accompanying this work are also things called elevations. These are things that are quite difficult to explain, but through this talk we'll kind of go through what these are and how they're made. But I guess for now you can just know that these are a series of numbers which align in certain ways to make shapes. And the meaning of these shapes we'll kind of go into a bit of detail with. There is also a sound component, which we'll play a little bit later. But for now, you know, just kind of keep in your mind, there's a sculpture, elevations which are made out of numbers, and we also have a sound work.
That's great. Thanks, Ren. I found it really interesting that you chose a cinder block as the core subject of your studies and research. And because it is something that we walk past and see very often in our surroundings, it was really interesting how you attempted to translate that into something that is a basic unit of the global modernity and to find its global context. Would you like to start from how you came to explore this theme and how you chose the cinder block as your core subject?
Yep, definitely. So North of a Solid Ground, as I said, was kind of produced at the time when Canberra was really experiencing quite a large shift. So obviously the world in 2020 has experienced a large shift, but I moved to Canberra in December 2019. And during that time, severe bushfires in Southeast Australia were just really ravaging the region. And it was an interesting time when the soil and the ground in Canberra was completely parched. It was so bone dry that the ACT government had put out a call for people in Canberra just to put as much water on trees in order to prevent a massive die-off of plants. So it was quite a time where everyone was very aware of environmental change and really aware of the kind of impacts that were affecting even urban areas. It wasn't kind of summer that was far away, that an experience that was distant. It was very close. And in March, we started to kind of really see all of the effects of the lockdowns start to come into place. So it was a time when I and many people around me were really aware of the heightened sense of emergency. The sky in Canberra was often red in January because of the bushfire smoke. And COVID had kind of started to kind of prompt this what seemed a bit like a slow wave of vulnerability. So there was a sense of vulnerability everywhere. And so at the time that this was all happening, I had kind of seen a little concrete block wall. And it was very peripheral. It was just kind of a thing that was just on the side of a car park. It meant nothing. But then at the same time as COVID-19 started to really prompt lockdowns in Australia, the drought started to break. And so we had in Canberra a very interesting point where the ground that had been completely parched and was totally red very quickly became green and lush. But then the world was kind of going into this kind of lockdown, vulnerable mode. And so regular rain was transforming the environment. And it was kind of at this point where I think a lot of people entered a psychological space where you're a bit disoriented because there's so much change, and the change is such a massive scale. And I think everyone has kind of heard about things like the massive impacts of climate change now and into the future. But I think it was an experience of me when I just kind of was very aware of not just the global scale of climate change, but the personal scale of it. And so this brick wall kind of, I guess subconsciously in many ways, became the symbol of a unit, of this larger unit, which was made up of the smaller parts, kind of a society made up of people. And then this kind of concrete block that had been broken off at one point was also sitting to the side. And I think just one day, after I work at a gallery in Canberra, and I think a couple of days after we had to close the gallery because of COVID, I noticed this concrete block, and it was really curious because it was all of these amazing things that happened that I never thought I would ever imagine seeing. And this concrete block would just sat there. It was just so persistent. It was just being amongst a world of quite turmoil. And so I really wanted to, in this moment, really figure out why this particular object was kind of becoming so heavy with meaning, and why it was becoming a symbol for persistence of architectural spaces, of urban spaces, and the way that they appear to be resistant to effects like global change, climate change, like the smoke, like the virus, but are really linked to those mechanisms. So the work was really about trying to get into this substructural system that allowed this concrete block to have this particular function and particular property. So the research questions really became, what are the structures that have made this so resilient when so many other systems seem to be kind of dropping off?
I think it was also more interesting to know that you are located in Canberra, which kind of a city that stands for like political powers, and more of a very planned city, structured in a very from the start. And I think within that context to translate your own experience with the encounter with the cinder block, I think it was really interesting that you used that reflective personal approach in your research. How did you sort of interrogate how the cinder block was being used as the symbol of the basic unit for our standardized industrial world, human industry?
Yeah, human industry became a really it became an important kind of symbol in many ways, because the block, it is itself, it's just a material, but it is the product of many different layers of systems that govern its design, its global distribution, its transportation, its method of production. When you kind of even just in a very cursory way just look at a concrete block and how it's actually made, it's actually really linked to so many different systems. And you don't really think about that too much because there's no handprint, there's no kind of human cue to make you think, well, this actually isn't a natural object. It's something that's actually really heavily designed and really heavily engineered. And so kind of with that research, I had, it was kind of concurrently with the experience of COVID. Just living in the world and living in that time. And many of the days during COVID, we were kind of told not to go too far from our houses. But at that time, there was an oval near my home. And it was kind of a very kind of a surreal place in many ways, because many days I would just go out and just watch the sun, and you could see Mercury and you could see the moon. And all you could do was just kind of lie there or sit there and just watch the moon move or the sun move, or kind of like Mercury slowly dip across the horizon. And so these ideas were kind of bubbling in my head, and I was kind of doing a bit of research into the manufacture of concrete, and then kind of witnessing really the only constant that was kind of really pinpointable at that time was just the movement of these celestial bodies. The sun was always going to rise, the moon was always going to move across the sky, that Mercury's path was quite predictable. And so I started to kind of research these two things together. So this concrete block and then human geography. And there's a wonderful book called, oh, it's just behind me actually. There's a wonderful book written by Lucia Harrison, which is from the 1920s actually. And it's called Daylight, Twilight, Darkness and Time. And it's a really, it is such a small book, but I think the diagrams in particular kind of resonate with this kind of aesthetic quality of repetition, of predictability, but also a type of calculability. You can calculate, for example, the position of the sun throughout the seasons. So I think as these two systems kind of streams of research were coming together, I also was thinking about the horizon line, which is really this kind of navigation point. And so all of that started to come together when I kind of realized that these systems were kind of linked, not necessarily through the concrete block being analogous to the sun or the moon, but that they were all kind of linked by this, not quite a dance, but there were processes that kind of were the same, applied to each other, but existed in a very different way. So you've kind of got the sun, which is moving in a circular pattern and just kind of doing its thing. And you have this cinder block, which is produced and just doing its thing. And so trying to figure out a way to kind of understand both and why they were seeming at that time to be linked was really key, but difficult actually.
Yeah, it's a difficult job to translate something that's intangible. And I think what you're exploring is those intangible aspects of those objects, cinder block and the sun, and how, what kind of technology did you use to integrate those two?
Yeah, so I started to think about the cinder block. How do you actually get into it? How do you actually, if you're trying to understand the substructures that are allowing it to have these physical qualities, how do you enter into the structure of the cinder block itself? And I'm just going to share my screen now. Kind of in my research, I came across a very interesting body of work that was done by NASA and the European Space Agency, where they had used quite a number of years of research data to kind of sonify, so create sound from this recorded kind of image data from the surface of the sun. So the sun's kind of environment is very rich in its movement, as we all know, but there isn't really a straightforward way for scientists to look beyond the surface of the sun and into its core in order to be able to analyze it. And so as I was kind of thinking about the sun, I came across this research where, just like kind of NASA, I was trying to get into the core of the cinder block. And the sound which NASA ended up kind of producing, so NASA got all of this surface information from the sun and then converted it into sun in order to be able to diagnose the inner workings of the sun, was just kind of, it just resonated. It's just this incredible hum that sounds, it's kind of sped up, you know, it's augmented by people. It's not 100% natural. But it kind of, in some ways, expresses the sun, and it expresses a physical quality in an intangible way, which is something that is quite difficult to achieve. So I might play a little bit for you, but I'm just going to check some of my settings to make sure that you can hear my screen, because this can be a little bit tricky. Share computer sound.
And
so if you,
a friendly warning for those of you who are wearing headphones, maybe turn your volume down a little bit just in case.
Yeah, it is a little bit screechy, but we'll just play it hopefully a little bit soft. So this sound that you're going to hear is the conversions of the sun's environmental data into sound, and this is converted by NASA. Yeah, and so that's it. So it was very inspiring kind of hearing this, because I thought, well, maybe I can do something similar. And in the end, I found, I had known of this process before, a process called photogrammetry. So photogrammetry, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this, about the process of creating the sculptural 3D print, which is this blue object here. Photogrammetry is a process that was invented in about 1858, so it's actually a really old process, where a wonderful architect called Meidenbrouwer wanted to take measurements of a cathedral. Unfortunately, he almost fell off, so he tried to use a new emerging technology called photography to take thousands upon thousands of photos of the cathedral and buildings in general. And from those photographs, use a bit of algebra and the concept of the vanishing plane in order to create very accurate measurements of buildings. And through that process, he was able to create algorithms and processes that could produce incredibly accurate reproductions of very tall buildings without having to touch them. And that process has kind of been refined over the years into what we kind of now know as photogrammetry. Photogrammetry, in its essence, is taking hundreds, or, 100 or hundreds of photographs of an object from 360 degrees. And from that process, you can feed those photos into a program such as Meshroom. I'm going to talk about Meshroom today. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the best way to make a photogrammetric reconstruction, but it is an open source software and is actually really user friendly. So if you're considering using photogrammetry in any way, I would definitely consider this as being like a great entryway product. And I'll just show you a short video which will kind of give you a little bit of an overview of Meshroom. So Meshroom uses an interface where you input your photographs and goes through a process of trying to kind of align features that are prevalent in your photographs into some kind of relationship. Usually that's with distance. Meidenbrouwer in 1858 did a massive amount of manual calculations in order to just figure out the materials properties, so just the measurements, sorry. But Meshroom and photogrammetry has really evolved where you can create an incredible amount of detailed recreations in 3D space using these kind of programs. So this is not something that's really been around that long. I guess it would be relatively new in some ways, these kind of open source frameworks that allow you to kind of plug in images of an object in order to be able to recreate them in 3D space. But they create an incredible thing called a mesh. It's kind of a little bit small, but you can kind of see some of the images, and you can go back and have a look at some of these explanatory videos of kind of converting even a tree trunk, which I have done, into an object in 3D space. So the wonderful thing about photogrammetry is it goes through a series of different processes. And again, I'm just going to show you this on the Atlas Vision website, because if you are interested and you want to learn a bit more, the explanations here are really simple to understand. In order to kind of take a photograph and turn it into a 3D mesh, so turn it into 3D geometry, it needs to go through a series of phases: natural feature extraction, image matching, feature matching, structure from motion, which is a fascinating process all in itself, depth maps, so creating depth, creating a mesh from which the object can be defined in 3D space, texturing, localization, and from localization you can get a fully reconstructed object. It's too much to kind of go into depth here, but if you are interested and you want some really great information about how photogrammetry actually operates, it's a wonderful resource. So from my Cinder block, which was actually this object kind of on the right, Cinder block on the right, that was the original. I used photogrammetry to take about 170 photographs of the full object, so every surface, and then put that into a piece of software like Atlas Vision. And from that object, I was given a mesh. I generated a mesh. And you can kind of see some of that coming through in the 3D print here. So the mesh is a series of polygons and vertices that actually define where an object is in space. So in this object here, just imagine that there are many, many, many different points which define exactly where the object is in space, and they'll kind of bring the object together and define how a curve is made or where a bump is. And every one of those vertices in the 3D mesh has a X, Y, Z coordinate. So just a standard X, Y, Z coordinate in space. The lovely thing for me is if we kind of go back to the sun's NASA conversions, X, Y, Z coordinates coordinate really well with sine, cos, tan waves. So you can very quickly and very easily, if you have a 3D object, convert the X, Y, Z into sine, cos, tan and produce sound. So my process was really focused on how you can get a 3D object, convert it into a digital geometry, and then use that digital geometry to create sound that then allows you to explore, or in a way that's not just limited to touch, how an object works, how it functions beyond its structure. And I'll play you a bit of the sound conversion now, but I will warn you, as we did before, Kelly, this conversion is very screechy. So if you are listening with headphones, I would definitely suggest now that you just kind of turn your sound down quite low. I'll play it for about 30 seconds, so you will have time to adjust your sound. So maybe go down to the lowest sound setting and then just work your way up. Yeah, that's probably the best way to do it, isn't it? So we'll play that sample now, because you've probably got your... So it's quite an intense sound, and that is essentially the sound of all of the vertices of the Cinder block as a mesh. And that audio goes for about 15 minutes. It is quite long. I recently converted a fire hydrant, and because of the fire hydrant's textures and surfaces, the same process means that the sound actually goes for 45 minutes. So the amount of data that can be extracted and amount of auditory, sensible experience that you can get from an object in this method can be very rich and very very unexpected. I had no idea that before this, that kind of getting an object to this point would be, with today's technology, actually quite simple. I think many times in my career, I've had an idea, but I've had to wait for technology to become either free because I don't have a lot of money, or for there to be kind of enough of a groundswell of knowledge about how to do a process in order for me to kind of bypass some of my technological limitations. And so this has been a really wonderful project because it's one of those rare moments where, you know, like pardon the pun, like everything did align. And it was really such an incredible time to make art, really. I think, you know, all the artists at Trocadero probably would have experienced a similar thing.
That's right. In the midst of the pandemic and also with the Australian bushfires we experienced earlier last year, I think it really restricted what artists can do in their space, and also you know, the loss of the studio space and also the outside space did had a huge impact on artists' practices. And I also wanted to know a little bit more about the prints, the imagery you produced from the numbers and the coordinates you generated from the objects.
Yeah, so this is when we, at the very start, I just showed you those images that kind of just look like shapes, really. In many ways, that's kind of what they are. But one of the processes, as I kind of said, in Alice Vision, there are a number of different pipelines, so a number of different processes that a program needs to go through in order to produce a recreation of a 3D object. That includes things like image matching and feature matching. And on my website, you will see a thing called elevations. So these are the things that we went through. These particular objects are really fascinating because the sound that I had produced was from the coordinates of the points in space of the digital object. And this is an interesting artifact of the photogrammetry process where the computer needs to match the real life with the simulated. And it does that through a series of numbers. And I'll just go into a different screen here. In order to do that, you kind of get a file at the end, at the very, very, very end. You get this file that has 7 different folders in it, and it has every one of those different processes in it. And I came across this, what I call an elevation. This particular image is actually a series of numbers which describe the computer matching the real world and the simulated. And as you kind of zoom out, you start to see this lattice appear. It's very intriguing, and it's very sculptural. And there is, for some reason, which I'm not 100% sure of, a relationship between the object as a simulated thing and the process of recreating an object from real life, so matching those two, that creates these I would imagine that it's kind of made from percentage of overlap. There's some kind of relationship to the distance that singular object numbers, so these number sets, have with the one before and after it. So there's a percentage, so maybe like 397821117 is maybe like, I don't know, 33 degrees plus east. There's some kind of formula within that, which is what I'm starting to unpack now. But it creates these quite amazing lattices. And so North of a Solid Ground, as an exhibition, it's going to be first exhibited at a little RE called Tributary in April of this year. Will be exhibited together with this installation with the blue cinder block and these drawings. And from these drawings in the exhibition, you'll actually see this elevation map, but I have laboriously used pen to write over each of the numbers, which creates an interesting, again, layering effect. I think a lot of my process really comes down to units and layering and repetition. And that's something I've actually noticed quite recently. I just completed a work that I'd been kind of formulating since 2008, which is a long time, and that's generally how long I work. Yeah, probably a little bit too long. But this is kind of really coming out the most in this work, and this process of creating a lattice is becoming more significant because it does describe in some way the unit and the way that unit functions as a whole, and the interweaving of those units, and how significant structure is to organization. It's not, you know, a brick wall, for example, isn't just a series of units repeated. You know, that there's a methodology that governs where it is and how it is in relation to others. And I guess that's kind of that positioning, which is also significant to what I'm doing here. Everything's in relationship, and everything contributes to the lattice through relationship between the thing itself, the thing to the east, the thing to the north, the thing to the west, the thing to the below, above. And that's where the title really comes from, the north of a solid ground, of this spatial relationship to things that are above, because I had made that connection between the celestial elements and this cinder block.
Wow, that's great. I think it's really fascinating that you started to examine something that is very like unseen objects and start to reconstruct and translate that in different formats and really examine them, break them down into different kind of units and sets of units. Should we open to questions now, or Ren, did you want to chat a little bit further about your research perhaps, or the upcoming exhibition?
Yeah, no, I think the great thing about the object is that they are, you know, you can look at them online, but they do have another life in person. So if you ever do have an opportunity to come and see the work, you know, I'd love for you to be able to do that. If you would like information about any upcoming shows, I've trained myself to be a little bit better at presenting news to the world. So if you do want any information about my upcoming shows, just head to my website, rengregorčič.com, and there is a news section which will give you a full list of the things that are happening. I've got a current show at M16 in Canberra at the moment. Tributary in Canberra is next. And then really looking forward to a show with a wonderful friend of mine, Jessie Wadone McGregor, who I'll be exhibiting at Airspace in Sydney in May.
That's great. We'll also make sure to include all this information and links to the projects and more information about those shows when we upload this video. And now we'll go ahead and take some time for questions now. Just a reminder, please be sure to type your questions into the chat, and you can always address them to either myself or Ren. It looks, we have a question from Sunmi. Okay. Yeah, she asks, what was your biggest concern throughout your research or throughout your development of the practice?
Oh, that's a good question. So within my PhD at the moment, I'm just started the second year. So for me, it's quite early on in the research. I think for me, my biggest concern whenever making a project is I tend to go quite broad, and I tend to research things that I think many people would consider be very disparate and disconnected. And sometimes the hardest thing is actually kind of using your intuition to figure out why they're persistently interesting. And that is definitely something that I've not necessarily struggled, but it's a concept that I've had to really refine, particularly if you work in the area of sculpture and spatial practice, which is my particular field. It is it can be a difficult thing to refine the difference between something that is interesting, something that's fruitful, and something that is actually going to lead to a project having its own life. And I guess that's what you really want, something to have its own life. So I think for me, it is really kind of making sure that I go far enough in order to be able to have enough of a field of knowledge in order to be able to produce something that I find is interesting, but also being able to narrow it down at the end so that it's something that's accessible to others.
That's right. From the Cinder block to the sun, sonic works to the numeric images, I guess it would be really hard to, I guess like when you hear them at the same time, they seem a bit disconnected, but then when you actually look into what the kind of the concept that frames those different interpretations, I think you see what you're exploring. We have another question from Chelsea. I know you've already introduced us a book as a reference, but are there any other readings critical to the process of your art making or other influences that you want to talk about?
There is quite a few different texts that I think, if you're working particularly in sculpture and spatial practice, there is really any book on applied geography. I think it seems like such a left field kind of something that's maybe kind of towards sciences and kind of further away from art making. But applied geography is really looking about how humans and the world interact, and whether or not that is through a natural process, such as like just wind patterns, or how humans have learned to use certain weather patterns for certain types of farming processes, or how, for example, cities are producing, because they're so tall, skyscrapers are so tall, wind is passing over the tops of skyscrapers and producing infrasound, which is a low-level sound which can cause many different types of environmental consequences. So I think if that has always applied geography has always been something that's been really interesting to me. It's something that I've explored quite a lot. And if you are also kind of wanting to or inspired by some of these processes, I think that that's a wonderful, any book really, a textbook, a book from the 1920s. They're all really great. Actually, it's really fascinating. If you go through the research of applied geography, the theories and the ideas really do change depending on the time. And you realize kind of how time is and geography is really set by cultural values and cultural norms. A lot of the things that we think are kind of natural, when you kind of go into the deep specifics, things really change, and you realize how much influence language has, or naming has, or the way that you describe a thing can really change what you think you know about something, and shifting some of those patterns can be really helpful.
It does look like we're running out of time, but we'll just take one more question from Kim. what about the sonic works interests you the most?
That's really interesting. I think what I've really tried to do in some ways is make sensible, in terms of the senses, make sensible a thing that we often will only associate with the eye or the hand. And when you kind of are in the space, I don't just use a speaker to play objects, to play the sounds. I actually use this thing called a vibrating speaker.
Oh, wow.
And the vibrating speaker is essentially just a speaker without all of all the parts that kind of produce sound into air. It converts whatever the speaker is on into the sound emitter. So often I will just set this vibrating speaker onto a concrete slab, and it will essentially turn all of the concrete slab into the resonant vibrator. And it creates a very visceral sound because it's muffled. The sound that you did here was actually quite a high pitch, because in order to feed it through concrete and have you experience it, you actually have to change the vibration just a little bit so it passes through. But it passes through the installation, it passes through, which is quite amazing because the concrete blocks have the hollow in the middle. So it creates a very interesting tone the closer you get into it. So it's it really is a physical experience. And it's really fun to play with things like vibrating speakers and using materials to become a resonator.
Wow, I would love to go have that physical experience with the work. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, it's an incredible technology.
Yeah. Ren, was there anything else you wanted to cover before we have a wrap up?
No, that's really it. I think I'm always interested in and happy to help people on their journey to understand some of these processes. So if you do have any questions about recommendations for programs, or if you are interested in doing your own conversions, it can be a really wonderful world. It does take a bit of time to learn, but programs are getting easier to use all the time. So this is really something that I'd encourage anyone to kind of look into, no matter what kind of a field of practice you're in.
I'll definitely go check out the Mushroom program. Sounds like very approachable, actually.
Yeah, it's pretty great. The explanations are really wonderful, and there's step-by-step guides. So you actually don't need any prior knowledge.
Awesome. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. We appreciate you being here. And thanks, Ren, for your wonderful presentation and explanation behind your work. Yeah, thanks again for joining us. And please stay tuned for our next Troc Talks project.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks, Ren. Bye.